Nah, the manila envelope sat on the mahogany desk like an unexploded bomb. Inside were the final probate documents for the estate of Andrew Gallagher, a grandfather Rachel hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Sitting in the sterile, high-rise office of Boston estate attorney Harrison Caldwell, Rachel expected a modest life insurance policy or perhaps the deed to her grandfather's aging suburban home. Instead, Caldwell slid a heavy brass key across the table, attached to a faded plastic diamond that read, Whispering Pines Motor Lodge. He owned a motel? Rachel asked, her brow furrowing. Since 1982, Caldwell replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Located off Route 28 in the Catskills. He closed it to the public 15 years ago. According to the tax records, it's been completely abandoned ever since. The property taxes have been paid automatically from a trust that the land is yours now. You'll likely want to demolish the structures and sell the acreage. Rachel was a practical woman, a 34-year-old structural engineer who dealt in load-bearing walls and concrete, not family mysteries. But the revelation gnawed at her. Why had Andrew, a retired and notoriously frugal accountant, secretly held onto a rotting roadside motel in upstate New York? Determined to assess the property for a quick sale, Rachel packed her SUV that weekend and drove 3 hours west into the dense, rain-soaked timberland of the Catskill Mountains. The motel emerged from the fog like a forgotten relic. It was a classic L-shaped, single-story structure from the 1970s, choked by overgrown rhododendrons and creeping ivy. The neon sign near the highway was completely rusted out, its glass tubing shattered years ago by local teenagers. Rachel parked on the cracked asphalt, pulling her jacket tight against the damp autumn chill. She carried a heavy flashlight, a crowbar, and a clipboard, ready to document the rot. The silence of the place was oppressive, broken only by the sound of dripping water from the sagging gutters. Using the master key Caldwell had provided, she forced open the door to the manager's office. The air inside was thick with the suffocating smell of mildew and dust. Old promotional brochures were scattered across the linoleum floor. Behind the front desk sat a heavy, leather-bound guest ledger, its pages worked by years of humidity. Curiosity getting the better of her, Rachel wiped the grime from the cover and opened it to the final pages. She wanted to see when the life had drained out of the Whispering Pines. The entries were standard for the early 2000s traveling salesmen, leaf-peeping tourists, families passing through. The final official check-in was dated October 14, 2008. Room 112-2 checked out the following morning. But as she flipped the page, a single, solitary entry stood out, written in her grandfather's unmistakable, sharp handwriting. Date, November 2nd, 2008. Room 104. Guest name, T. Riley. Checkout, blank notes, paid in full. Do not disturb. Rachel frowned. Every other line in the ledger had a neat, red line drawn through it upon checkout. Room 104 remained uncrossed. Leaving the office, Rachel walked down the long exterior corridor. The wooden overhang groaned under the weight of wet pine needles. She peered through the grimy windows of the first few rooms. Rooms 101, 102, and 103 were exactly what she expected. Collapsing ceilings, mattresses stripped to their springs, and nature slowly reclaiming the interiors. Then she reached room 104. The first thing she noticed was the window. Unlike the others, which were coated in a decade of grime, the glass on 104 was blacked out from the inside. Not painted, but meticulously covered with thick, light-blocking material. The second thing she noticed sent a cold spike of adrenaline through her chest. The door was secured with a massive, heavy-duty master lock. But the lock wasn't rusted. It was gleaming silver, heavily oiled, and bore not a single speck of dirt. It was modern. Rachel stepped back, her heart thumping against her ribs. The motel had been abandoned for 15 years. Her grandfather had died 6 months ago. Yet, someone was maintaining this lock. She looked down. The concrete walkway directly in front of room 104 was swept clean of the pine needles that blanketed the rest of the corridor. Her practical instincts told her to get back in her car and call the local police. Squatters were common in abandoned properties, but a squatter wouldn't put a $100 industrial padlock on the outside of a door. They locked themselves in, not out. Gripping her crowbar tightly, Rachel wedged the curved steel behind the heavy padlock clasp. It was anchored to an older, deteriorating wooden doorframe. She didn't need to break the lock. She just needed to break the rotting wood holding the hasp. With a sharp grunt of effort, she leaned her entire body weight onto the crowbar. The 70-year-old pine splintered with a loud crack that echoed off the surrounding trees. The metal hasp tore free, and the door swung inward. Rachel braced herself for the stench of decay, or perhaps the aggressive shout of an angry trespasser. Instead, she was met with a wave of warm, dry air. She smelled ozone, the faint scent of stale tobacco, and Folger's coffee. She reached instinctively for the light switch on the wall and flipped it. To her absolute shock, the room flooded with bright fluorescent light. "What on earth?" she whispered. Room 104 was not a motel room. The bed, the dresser, and the television had been entirely removed. In their place was a makeshift command center. The walls were entirely lined with corkboards, connected by an erratic web of red and black string. Thousands of documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings were pinned to the boards. A large wooden desk sat in the center of the room, holding a bulky desktop computer from the late 2010s, a laser printer, and a coffee mug that still had a ring of brown liquid at the bottom. In the corner, a modern dehumidifier hummed quietly, its reservoir actively draining through a small plastic tube routed out a hole drilled in the floor. Someone was living here, not surviving, but working. Rachel slowly stepped inside, her eyes scanning the chaotic walls. The clippings were all from local upstate New York papers, dating back to the early 1990s. As she stepped closer to the primary corkboard, her breath hitched in her throat. Right in the center was a faded photograph of a young couple laughing in a park. It was her parents. Beneath the photo was a headline from the Catskill Daily Mail, dated April 14, 1994, Trey G. ICC Intent own Route 9, course Trey, Koppel, perishes in ferry crash. Rachel had been 6 years old when her parents died. She had been raised by her grandfather, Andrew, who always told her that a blown tire on a rain-slicked mountain road had caused her father to lose control of their sedan. But the documents on this wall told a terrifyingly different story. There were copy police reports highlighting inconsistencies in the tire marks. There were heavily redacted financial records from Whitmore Logging, a massive local timber conglomerate. There were surveillance photos of the town's former sheriff, Bill Sterling, accepting thick envelopes from a man Rachel recognized from local politics as Richard Whitmore, the current mayor of the neighboring town. In thick black marker, her grandfather had written across a manila folder, "They didn't blow a tire. They were run off the road." Rachel's hands began to shake. She reached out to touch a manifest from Whitmore Logging when a sound from the bathroom froze the blood in her veins. The toilet flushed. Rachel stumbled backward, raising the crowbar. The bathroom door, which had been slightly ajar, swung open. Standing in the doorway was an old man. He looked to be in his late 70s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and suspenders. He had a scruffy white beard and sad, heavy-lidded eyes. In his right hand, he held a wet rag. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked defeated. "You have Andrew's eyes," the man said. His voice was gravelly, worn down by years of underuse. "Who are you?" Rachel demanded, gripping the iron bar so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What is this place? How do you have electricity? I passed the town grid 10 years ago." "Dug the trench myself," the man said softly, stepping slowly into the room and keeping his hands visible. "Andrew paid the utility company for an agricultural pump meter a mile down the road. I ran the line from there. I asked who you are." The man looked at the corkboard, specifically at the photo of Rachel's parents. "My name is Thomas Riley. I've been checked into room 104 for a very long time." The name from the ledger. "You're trespassing," Rachel said. trying to maintain her authority, though her voice trembled. "I'm calling the police. If you call the local police, Richard Whitmore will have this entire room incinerated before the sun goes down," Thomas replied evenly. "And I'll likely be found floating in the Ashokan Reservoir." "Why?" Thomas walked over to the desk and sank heavily into the rolling chair. "Because 32 years ago, I drove a logging truck for Whitmore Industries. And I'm the man who ran your parents off Route 9. Rachel felt the floor drop beneath her. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. She backed up against the doorframe, her mind spinning. "Your father," Thomas continued, his voice cracking with emotion, "was a forensic auditor for the state. He was investigating Whitmore for illegal clear-cutting on protected state lands and for bribing Sheriff Sterling to look the other way. He found the proof. Whitmore's father ordered me to run his car off the cliff. They told me if I didn't do it, my own family would be the ones going over the edge." "You killed them," Rachel whispered, tears of shock pricking her eyes. "I did," Thomas said, a single tear escaping his weathered eye. "And the guilt ate me alive. When your grandfather Andrew started asking questions, the police shut him down. So he hired a private investigator. He found me. He cornered me in a bar in Albany." Thomas looked up at the ceiling. "I expected him to kill me. He had a gun. But Andrew, he was a different kind of man. He realized I was just a pawn, and that Whitmore was actively tying up loose ends. 2 other drivers had already committed suicide. Andrew offered me a deal." Thomas gestured around the room. "He told me to disappear. He brought me here to this abandoned motel. He told me he would protect me, keep me hidden, provide for me, if I helped him build an airtight case against Whitmore and the local authorities. A case so big, they couldn't just sweep it under the rug." "That was in 2008, Rachel said, looking at the volume of files. "Why are you still here?" Andrew realized the corruption went deeper than the local police. It went to the state judges. We had to wait for the old guard to retire to die off. We were compiling the final financial link between Mayor Richard Whitmore and the offshore accounts his father used. Thomas slumped. "Then Andrew had his stroke. He died before we could take it to the FBI. So you just stayed locked in a motel room?" "I have nowhere else to go, Rachel," Thomas said gently. "I'm a dead man walking. I leave this room at night to get groceries in the next county over. I lock the padlock from the outside by reaching through a gap in the window frame, so anyone driving by thinks the room is sealed. I've spent the last 6 months finishing your grandfather's work." He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a thick black flash drive. He placed it on the desk. "It's all here. The offshore bank routes, the bribery ledgers, my own signed confession. Everything." Suddenly, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the silence. Rachel whipped her head toward the blacked-out window. Through a tiny slit in the fabric, she saw a sleek black SUV pulling up to the manager's office. 2 men stepped out in heavy raincoats. "Whitmore's private security," Thomas said, his face paling. "They've been circling the property ever since the probate notice went public. They know Andrew owned this land, and they suspected he hid the evidence here. They saw your car." "We have to go," Rachel said, the reality of the danger finally overriding her shock. Her practical engineering mind snapped into problem-solving mode. "I can't run," Thomas said, standing up. "I'll stall them. Take the drive. Take it straight to the federal building in Albany. Don't stop for state troopers. I am not leaving you here to be murdered to cover up my parents' deaths," Rachel yelled, grabbing the flash drive and shoving it into her pocket. She grabbed Thomas by the arm. "Is there a back door?" "It's a motel, Rachel. There are only front doors." "Then we make a back door," she said fiercely. She looked at the drywall separating room 104 from room 105. She raised the heavy steel crowbar. "Stand back." With 3 massive adrenaline-fueled swings, Rachel smashed through the brittle, decaying drywall. She kicked the wooden studs, creating a hole just large enough to squeeze through into the adjacent, ruined room. They heard heavy footsteps on the concrete walkway outside. A fist pounded on the heavy wooden door of room 104. "Hey, we saw the lock was broken." "Open up," a voice shouted. Rachel pushed Thomas through the hole into the darkness of room 105, then scrambled through after him. They navigated the rotting floorboards and slipped out the front door of 105 just as the men kicked in the door to 104. Using the cover of the overgrown rhododendrons, Rachel and Thomas sprinted through the freezing rain toward her SUV. She started the engine, threw it into reverse, and tore out of the parking lot, spraying gravel across the rusted neon sign. 72 hours later, Rachel sat in a brightly lit conference room at the FBI field office in Albany. Thomas Riley sat beside her, looking exhausted but strangely at peace, his hands cuffed to the table. Across from them sat 3 federal prosecutors staring at the contents of the black flash drive on a projector screen. The raid on Mayor Richard Whitmore's estate happened the next morning. The evidence Andrew Gallagher and Thomas Riley had spent 15 years compiling was flawless. It unraveled a multi-million-dollar corruption ring that led to the indictment of the mayor, a sitting judge, and a dozen local officials. Thomas Riley was charged with vehicular manslaughter. But given his decades of cooperation, his age, and the fact that he blew the whistle on a massive criminal enterprise, the federal judge showed unprecedented leniency, placing him in a secure, minimum security medical facility for the remainder of his days. 2 months later, Rachel stood once again in front of the Whispering Pines Motor Lodge. The heavy machinery of O'Connor Construction idled behind her. She had signed the demolition order that morning. As the excavator's massive steel claw tore into the roof of room 104, bringing the secret sanctuary crashing down into a cloud of dust and splintered wood, Rachel felt a strange sense of closure. Her grandfather hadn't been a distant, cold man. He had been a sentinel, standing guard over the truth, sacrificing his own peace so that one day she might have hers. She walked back to her car, turning the key in the ignition. For the first time in 15 years, the Whispering Pines was finally, entirely checked out.